I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Gareth, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Happy Thanksgiving Eve. And as always, I'd like to remind you that you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I should be dropping the first part of a two-part episode with C. Derek Varn of the Parallax Vlog on the Patreon for members in the next day or so. So if you're a Patreon supporter, remember you do get that bonus content, and those episodes go long. So check that out at patreon.com/parallaxviews. And now on to the show. We're going to be speaking with Ralph Leonard, who is now writing for The New Statesman. He describes himself as a conservative Marxist, and he is across the pond in the UK. So we're going to be getting his perspective on the American election and its aftermath from a non-US viewpoint. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with returning guest Ralph Leonard. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very glad to be speaking with. He describes himself as a conservative Marxist on Twitter, and he's a British-Nigerian writer on international politics, religion, culture, and humanism, who has written for publications like Sublation Magazine and Unheard. How are you doing, Ralph Leonard?
I'm good. Hope all is well in the States.
Well, it's pretty crazy right now, at least with tensions running high. But what's your initial reaction to the U.S. election as someone who's looking at it from across the pond?
Well, my original prediction was that, or let me start by saying that when the moment that Joe Biden had his car crash of a debate and Trump dodged the bullet, from then I was utterly convinced that Trump would win. But then when they changed to Kamala Harris and dumped Joe Biden, I was thinking maybe they've got a little bit more of a chance. And then my prediction, like about a month before the election, was that Trump would win the popular vote, but Kamala Harris would get in through the Electoral College. So it would be like an ironic reversal of 2016. So in a sense, I wasn't surprised that Trump won the popular vote, but I was a little bit surprised at how he won the election, like gaining both Electoral College votes and the popular vote, and he managed to swing demographics that nobody thought he would have a chance of gaining onto his side, and that's what won him the election. So in a way, I'm not surprised, but at the same time, I am a little bit surprised as well. At the same time,
I know some of my listeners are asking this right now, but they're probably wondering, why did they think he would get the popular vote but not the electoral? Like, what was your thinking behind that at the time? I don't want to dwell on it too much,
yeah.
but
Um, some of it was just for the discourse that it would be kind of it would just be ironic, wouldn't it, if what happened in 2016 happened but worked against Trump's favor. So I wouldn't say I based it on anything scientific or anything like that. But I did have an intuition that because there's a lot of like commentary now about how various non-white ethnic groups somehow swung to Trump. I did have an intuition that that would happen, and I have written about it before for Unheard that there is a little bit of a realignment going on, but I didn't expect it to be this this deep. I didn't expect it to be like this. Um, so that yeah, so it was just a little bit of you know I just want the irony to happen, and especially since like nobody would be saying after if Kamala Harris won the electoral college but not the popular vote, nobody would be saying, "Oh, the electoral college saved the American Republic from fascism." You know?
right. Well, so let's get into I mean, we've seen the post-mortem sort of blame game going on, and I see some people saying, "Oh, this is all the fault of white men and women voting for Trump," and then I see people saying, "Oh no, it was more of a multiracial coalition." And then I see people only blaming Latino male voters and saying, "Oh, not many black male voters voted for Trump." But I think the multiracial coalition thing is the most true out of all of that. Maybe you want to delve into that. What is your perspective?
I think um, one illusion that has been, I think, shattered by this election, and I think should be shattered, is this idea that as America's demographic evolution becomes more non-white, or shall we say, the skin color gradient of America becomes more brown, that somehow naturally benefits the Democrats, because there was this discourse going on around the 2010s about the new Democratic majority, that from various sort of think tank people and political scientists that well, as more non-white people come to the United States and more Latinos migrate to the United States, that you know that will help the Democratic Party and screw the Republicans, because for some reason non-white people are just expected to vote Democrat apparently. Um, so I think if it was, and it was nonsense at the time, but if it certainly is more nonsense now, because you know obviously people vote out of things more than their race or more than their skin color or what they're expected to vote. Um, for example, there were certain like rural counties in Georgia that are majority black that voted for Trump. So that while in like places like Atlanta, which is very urbanized, they voted for Kamala. So that tells you that even within so-called like racial categories like blacks or Latinos, that there are all sorts of social, regional, class, and political divisions that I think a lot of our political discourse just ignores or obfuscates. So, and also there's this idea that because Black Americans and Latinos are Native Americans who voted like overwhelmingly in favor of Trump, that because they've been on the end of racism from white people, that they're somehow incapable of being like American nationalists or American nativists, in their own way. So there's that kind of idea going on, and that's just completely wrong because it's just not true.
You still with me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I was going to ask. So, with the people saying that there was no sort of multiracial coalition element to this, what do you want to say to them? Because I do think he did need more than just the white women and white men vote.
It's copium. Like it's just the blatant denial of reality. Because ironically, the one ethnic group in America that Trump's that declined in favor of Trump was white people. More white people voted for Kamala Harris than voted for Trump. Relatively speaking. And so that's if that just has to says it all because Trump simply could not have won the election if he just based it on white people. Um, and Trump's campaign, if you look at the campaign, they kind of realized this because you see how he was going to all sorts of like Latino uh, uh, districts and, meet up with all sorts of community leaders and saying, making his pitch to them. You saw the rally he had in Michigan with the Arabs, the Muslims who came up on stage and said, we're voting for Donald Trump because he's for peace and he's for family values, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, the basic pitch Trump was making was to Latinos or the black people who voted for him or to Native Americans or to Arabs was basically that, look, as Americans, you too have an interest in solving the border crisis or uh, the usual stuff he talks about because at
Yeah,
the
I
end of
think
the
that's an important point. Not to interrupt
yeah
you, but like there has
yeah
been, I think people sometimes overlook the fact that MAGA has really tried to promote itself as
mhm,
not necessarily like explicitly ethno-nationalist. It's civic nationalism that it's
yeah
going for.
yeah that and he was basically saying that, look, you too as Americans have an interest in solving the border crisis and the usual stuff he talks about because it's your jobs that are going to be on the line while the Democrats bringing all these illegal immigrants because that's part of the whole discourse that he makes this distinction between illegal immigrants, which is bad, and then what people who are, so to speak, assimilated or just Americans. Is like that's his whole point. That's the divide. People who are Americans and people who are not Americans but are trying to break into America and screw everybody over. And that's kind of the discourse he made. And I think people have a hard time with trying to understand how, you know, black and brown people can, vote for an overtly nationalist agenda, even one that is anti-immigration, without trying to resort to all these kind of really weird, condescending kind of explanations that, oh, they're just being brainwashed by white supremacy or they're really looking after the wages of whiteness, which is just a total atrocious misreading of Du Bois, because that's where that whole thing comes from. And, that they're not, they've been like, they're basically chickens for KFC. That's another one. um, and a part of, and what's even more distinct about this election is, how like certain Democrats have reacted to it because there is a kind of feeling that they've been betrayed by people they consider their people, their tribe. You were supposed to vote for us, not for him. And, that's why a lot of the, discourse from, various Democrat aligned groups and, on MSNBC is, no, you're the problem, not us. Yeah.
So what do you think the implications of that are going forward, especially for Democrats? Because like I said, I think the Republican Party and MAGA has been pushing this sort of I guess you could call it right-wing sort of civic nationalism. It's not necessarily as based on, at least not explicitly, it's not based on Keller, I think, in the way that people want to think. I mean, there is this sort of civic nationalist quality to it. I mean, it brought in people like Vivek Ramaswamy, so
Yeah,
I don't think it's just racial. It's very civic nationalist in its
yeah,
orientation.
yeah. It's good old fashioned nationalism, and it's just I guess you could say that's the proof that assimilation is working, isn't it? Um, uh, as far as the implications of this are, is that I think a lot of people on the left have always, you know, because I think what was wrong with the Donald Trump is a fascist discourse is that part of what the fear behind it is not that Donald Trump is actually a fascist, is that if Donald Trump got in the second time, that the Democrats would become more right wing in response to it. Like as as his history attests to this, that's really traditionally been the case. Every time the Republicans have won, like convincingly or in a shocking way, that's what the Democrats have tended to do: triangulate to the right. Like
Right,
after
right. We saw it with Bill
Nick
Clinton and the sort of movement
yeah,
towards like third way neoliberalism. Yeah.
yeah, and let's be real, that part of the discontent with the Democrats is to do with crime, in certain states at least. Like I think in California, like they voted down, prop. I can't remember what the number is. That is to do with the crime issue there. There's also immigration, and there is this perception that, oh, we lost because the Republicans have managed to portray the Democrats as the party of defund the police, um, unchecked mass immigration, and like transgender rights. Now, obviously, the reality of Kamala Harris's platform wasn't that. It clearly wasn't that. That's not
I
what.
wanted to talk about that because
Yeah,
I've been having pretty intense debates with people that say uh Harris's campaign was too I don't like this term, but like quote unquote woke. You know, and that word has been used so much now that I use it very little, but I don't think she did
no,
run
no,
that direction at all, to be
no.
honest.
No, 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 no. That's very true. She didn't. Like she didn't. Not even with the identity politics. Like no, there was very little of that this time. Aside from the whole white dudes for Harris thing. Like aside from that, there wasn't much, and she did herself didn't really press on it too much. So you can't blame this on wokeness or and but the fact is that there is that perception there that the Republicans have managed to rather successfully taint the Democrats as they are the extreme party of wokeness, mass immigration, open borders, defund the police, and radical transgender, ideology and all that. But always,
They've sort of painted
yeah,
the Democrats as being like it's like what I hear from I have a lot of like boomers that I talk to here in Florida, and they're
yeah,
like, well, I used to be a Democrat, but the liberals have gone too crazy, and
yeah,
Trump is just the candidate of common sense, and
yeah,
I think that is sort of like what Republicans have successfully done is they've sort of convinced, a swath of the population that it's, the Democrats are just too loony. They're
yeah,
moonbats, and the Republicans at least have some common sense.
yeah, yeah.
Not that
Well,
I don't believe that, but yeah.
no, I don't believe it either. But it's it's um it's fascinating because obviously people on the left would say that the Democrats were too conservative because of Kamala Harris's, campaigning with Liz Cheney, trying to basically appeal to the never Trump Republicans to create this sort of popular front of against Trump, that we have to keep out Donald Trump at all costs. That Harris's views on foreign policy were meek at best, like like was virtually indistinguishable from Joe Biden. um, and and this is how Trump. This is another thing about the Trump campaign: is how he managed to portray himself as the anti-war party, as to get the which is kind of funny because we all know that Trump's policy towards Israel isn't going to be any more dovish than Biden's policy, and it's kind of so fascinating how part of the people around Trump, like there was this tweet from like Eric Prince, the former Blackwater guy, who was saying about, oh, under Donald Trump we're going to have less endless wars, and which is so ironic coming from him, knowing the history of Blackwater. And another thing, and that's how the Republicans have portrayed like the two wars in Ukraine especially, as this is the Democrats' war, this is their war, this is their war for liberalism, wokeness, whatever, and we're gonna stop that. We're gonna, we're not gonna indulge Zelensky in his quixotic quest to, try and gain all the land back, and we're gonna put an end to this war. And even it's kind of weird how Donald Trump could get both in regards to the Palestine question, how he could get both conservative Orthodox Jews who think the Democrats are too soft in regards to Palestine and Israel, and at the other hand, get scores of Arab votes who think the Democrats are, sponsoring a genocide. Like, that's kind of crazy.
Not the thing that gets me with the Trump as anti-war figure thing is like historically he's been surrounded by Iran hawks.
Yeah,
So I mean I know people are saying, well, he didn't pick Pompeo this time, but I mean historically he has
yeah.
surrounded himself with like very hawkish figures when it comes to Iran as well.
But this time it had more legitimacy because he had J.D. Vance as vice president, and he was the one who was really pressing home that we're not gonna, that America is not in the business of embarking on like these grand ideological quests. We're gonna be more focused inward. You know, that was because that was the criticism of the whole aid to Ukraine. That why are you giving aid in the service of another war while people in the American heartlands are killing themselves with drugs and that kind of stuff. So this time, I think when JD Vance puts it, it kind of resonates more with people, especially as he, in contrast to Trump, is more soft spoken. He's more coherent, less kind of bombastic than when Trump would put it.
So, out of curiosity, you mentioned the whole discourse around is Trump a fascist? Isn't he? I mean, I get why people are afraid of Trump. I mean, the speech he gave where he was joking about, I don't care if someone shoots through the glass that's around me as long as they hit a few journalists.
Yeah.
I can get why people are like scared of him. But
Yeah.
I've always said I what scares me about Trump is I'm not even sure if he's a fascist. I just think I think he's a carny barker, to be honest. That's what scares me about him. But maybe we
What's
can talk a little bit about that and the just that discourse around it, whether or not he's a fascist character.
what's a carny barker?
What's a carny barker?
Yeah.
Like someone who works the carnival circuit and
Oh, okay.
is trying to sell you on like, oh, play this game that you can't possibly win, and we rigged against you. The sort of carny barker that hypes up the crowds and treats P.T. Barnum. There's a
Yeah,
sucker
yeah,
born
yeah,
every
yeah.
minute. That to me is Trump.
Yeah, I think a lot of the whole fascist argument is it's a total misrecognition of the problem because, and I'm not one of these people that says, oh, it's not fascism unless it's 1921. Like, I'm not one of those people, but the the point is like with Trump is that he's not like so out of the scale in terms of the spectrum of American politics there, and 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 obviously the fascist label has been used to diminishing returns against him. That when they tried it this time, it didn't sink in like it did last time. Because in 2016, he was an unknown quantity because no one knew what he would be like when he would come into the presidency. And but then after 4 years in president, the American Republic was still there. The earth didn't cave in. So like when he came in this time around, it's like, well, we've already had four years of him and we survived that. He can't be that bad if we vote for him again. And that's why whenever, the mainstream media like CNN started, drumming down the Trump likes Hitler. He's a fascist line. Like it just didn't sink in like before because people sort of suspected, yeah, that's just another sort of cheap tactic to try and like get rid of him or sort of stigmatize the idea of you could even vote for him. So like Trump is the thing about Trump is, yeah, he's right wing. Yeah, he has authoritarian impulses. There's no doubt about that. But not fascism. Like this really isn't the 1930s. This is like Trump is like another, maverick, populist, Republican type. Because people point out that really he's just something America like a New York Democrat. Because he used to be sympathetic to the
You cut out there for a second. You said what about him being like a Democrat? What was that?
Oh, so like some people would say that Trump is basically like a New York Democrat because he was once like sympathetic to the Democrats like in the 80s and 90s before he became more like right wing. And you know obviously like there's certain things about Trump that are obviously like grotesque, like the anti-immigrant stuff, like that's really really bad. And some of and while some of his comments, there is like a kind of humor to them that are kind of funny, like genuinely, but as well he can say some really really wild stuff that you can't really just kind of minimize. But that doesn't mean he's a fascist. And you know he can be bad without being a fascist, and saying that he's not a fascist doesn't minimize how bad he is or how he can be, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like I said, for me, I sort of see him as just sort of chaos incarnate. And instead of saying Carney Barker, I should have said like a he's like a showman. He's like a character. I mean, he literally used to work in pro wrestling, so I
Yeah,
mean, he's like a pro wrestling character come to life.
yeah, he's the heel president
Right.
who's now turned face, if you know what I mean.
So the original reason I had you on was to discuss this piece you wrote for Unheard entitled "Old School Leftism is Going Extinct in the Democratic Party." Now, I guess where we should start with that article is David Brooks of the New York Times came out and said, maybe the Democrats have to embrace a Bernie-style disruption. Something that will make people like him a little uncomfortable. He openly said that, and bravo to him for that. But I think you take the view that that's not going to happen. Why is that?
Because I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened like 4 years ago at the latest. So, I kind of take the view that Bernie's moment has kind of come and gone because he arose in 2016 rather similar to Trump on the left. So, Trump was the insurgent within the Republican Party, and Bernie was meant to be the left populist insurgent within the Democratic Party. Now, difference is that he didn't take over the Democratic Party because of course, you could say that the DNC screwed him over and all that kind of stuff. And what thing that was interesting about Bernie was, because his whole thing was, he's really a New Deal Democrat. I mean, that's kind of a bit simplifying, but it's a good, I think, estimation of his politics, because that's what his democratic socialism was really all about. He wanted to return to, so to speak, what the Democratic Party was pre neoliberalism, and obviously, like the likes of the Clintons and Obamas and like that whole Democratic Party establishment was like, no, we're not going to return to that, because they would say something like the economy has changed just so dramatically that what he's asking for is just quixotic or something like that. But at the same time, you have to admit that, like Trump, Sanders was a expression and a manifestation of popular discontent with the domestic and foreign policy consensus that had been supreme in America since the 1990s with Clinton, Bush, Obama, and you see this discontent expressed in different ways in Trump and Bernie in different styles. So obviously with
Yeah,
Trump,
and you
yeah,
see the sort of apolitical types, or not apolitical, but like what I mean is you'll see these people like a Joe Rogan or a Theo
yeah,
Vaughn that will
yeah,
be like, "Oh, I kind of like Trump," and then but they'll also say, I kind of like Bernie too, though,
yeah,
and I think it's because both are expressing sort of that same discontent.
yeah, because they're outsiders. Like they are genuine, like outsiders. That's why Joe Rogan liked Bernie, because he wasn't the typical Democratic Party person that he thinks of when he imagines it. He was, like I think even when Joe Rogan was talking with Cornel West, like Cornel West was talking about socialism, and like Joe Rogan was like intrigued, like, oh, that's kind of interesting, because when usually people of Joe Rogan's type, when they hear the word socialism, it's like, no, that's bad. That is state domination, unfreedom, Soviet Union, that sort of thing. So it was, but it's also more important that Bernie and Trump were kind of, I think, expressions of a post neoliberal kind of moment developing, and that's what 2016 was. That was like, I think, the paradigm shifting year and election, and we only kind of know this, after like now, because Trump got the second term, and I think that was the only way it would have really sunk in that how uh, emblematic like Trump was. Like if we look at him as a historical figure, that his rise wasn't just like a flash in the pan or like an anomaly that comes and goes. That it is an expression of very deep historical, social, political forces that is moving beyond neoliberalism, because we've had the neoliberal era for what, nearly 50 years, like mid 1970s till 2016, you know, and now it seems like we're going back to a moment of more nationalistic, protectionist, you know, and anti-globalization, but I think we have to be careful with using that term, because still, even with like tariffs and all that kind of protectionism, you know, the world economy is still incredibly integrated within capitalism. Obviously, so but you see what I'm trying to get at.
No, definitely, definitely. And I think like the other thing that appealed to people was just that I mean neither Bernie or Trump talked like your average. They didn't feel like they were they came out of a machine that teaches
Yeah,
you HR speak.
yeah, yeah, because it's actually kind of funny that a lot of the criticism of Trump was his rhetorical norms, the way he spoke, because of he would use like mild swear words that a president someone who's like presidential isn't supposed to use and like like the Kim Jong Un story where Kim Jong Un says like, remember, I've got a red button that I've got to use that I can use, and Trump replied, well, I've got a red button too, except mine's bigger and mine works. It's like stuff like that, like um but I'll just to make a point about what I was trying to say in the piece, that about Bernie, that even though Bernie was an attempt at trying to push the Democratic Party left, and he was like, his rise was also symbolic of a kind of resurgence of an old school leftism that was more focused on class, political economy, the dynamics of capitalism, as opposed to progressive neoliberalism that was associated with the Democratic Party, that was like had this kind of very narrow focus on like race, gender, sexual equality within a very restrictive neoliberal framework. And my point is that if this moment creates an opportunity for a left revival or some kind of movement towards a socialist movement, that it will happen outside the Democratic Party necessarily, because of the failure of the Bernie insurgency in 2020 and 2016, and especially because I think of the fractures within the Democratic Party over the war in Gaza for the past year, that means that it's going to happen outside the Democratic Party. But if it is to mean anything, it can't just be like it has to be one socially rooted in the working class and be based around like at least rebuilding or reconstituting civil society institutions, social institutions that once were the tribune of the working class, that so that people can organize socially and politically in the face of like atomization, and that has been experienced in society for decades. Um, and but what I fear is that what will actually happen is that it really just becomes like a kind of echo chamber for D class A professionals and wannabe intellectuals who just rail against the Democratic Party but are not um, progressing their own political project that's like independent of the Democratic Party, that doesn't try to curry favors with them, if you see what I mean.
Well, let's get into that more.
Yeah.
How do you think a left could build a movement outside the party? Because I almost think like there's an exhaustion of imagination that has happened where, I mean, there is this problem I see on the left where I think a lot of leftists can't think outside of tailism.
Yeah.
Like I've known leftists that think, well, we just have to keep tailing the Democratic Party, pushing them left. And then I've met some really odd types that think you can do the opposite and tail the Republicans and push them left, which I also don't really believe. But it seems like a lot of people are in the grip of this, like, well, we just have to follow these two parties and push them left, which is
Yeah.
weird to me because I see both parties as being parties of the ruling class. They're creatures
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah. Parties of capital.
Yeah.
And well, the point is that it's not, obviously there's not going to be an easy, quick solution, and because there's another tendency is the accelerationist thing, that if Trump gets elected, that will accentuate the contradictions and it'll create this objective crisis, and maybe, just maybe, there will be a post-capital outcome. But it's like, no, that's the wrong way to see it. There isn't going to be a Sorelian shortcut to this. Like, what ultimately has to happen is to rebuild a working, this is my socialism coming out, that a proletarian socialist movement that is rooted in civil society, politically constituted, that is independent of the two capitalist parties, the parties of capital, that doesn't curry favor with them, and doesn't see itself as some kind of pressure block on them, that has its own uh, political project, that and out of that can arise a socialist party. Now, I acknowledge it's very easy for me to just to say this, but how do you actually do it? It's a very hard question, because it's almost like we have to kind of rebuild civil society first before we can even get to this. And obviously, like, personally,
What do you mean for if listeners are just? I don't
yeah,
want listeners to think we're just using buzzwords. So what do you
yeah,
mean by like what do you mean by rebuilding civil society? I guess.
or so because so in the past few like decades that there's been this social atomizing effect that a lot of you know institutions that a lot of people you would use to socialize themselves, or working class people would organize around, like trade unions or civic clubs and stuff of this nature. um, that's very, very weak, and that's like kind of like the sphere where outside of the state, I must say, and outside of like these kind of NGO sort of types, where people can organize and become like social subjects. And it's kind of like we don't have that now, let alone like the Socialist Party for the proletarian working class dedicated to revolution, right? So it's almost like we have to start at ground zero and do the first thing before we even get to the Socialist Party, if you see what I mean. But I acknowledge it's very easy for me to say this, but how you actually concretely do it is very much a harder thing, which is kind of why I'm not the best when it comes to giving out positive solutions. It's almost like I can only do negative criticism, or what
You're good at the descriptive, but not
yeah,
necessarily the prescriptive.
yeah, what
Yeah.
Adorno called negative utopianism, you know.
So you also mentioned in this article that there's a distinction that needs to be made between sort of Bernie Sanders style leftism
Yeah,
and the squad as led by AOC. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
yeah, yeah, because I think obviously Bernie Sanders is a boomer socialist. Like he's from the '60s, and that's where his whole thing comes up. Was the squad, especially AOC, is like a millennial thing. Is there's that kind of progressivism, and they are. It's kind of weird because they are kind of portrayed. They would be perceived, because one difference between them and Bernie is Bernie was more successful at being able to attract a wide demographic of people to come behind him, which is why um, the demographics that Bernie was very popular with, like Latino men, uh, non-college educated young men, and working class people. The same demographic that was for Bernie voted for Trump. I would swung the election towards Trump. And whilst like AOC and the squad's kind of progressivism, it's kind of sort of perceived at any rate as like a more hardcore version of what the Democrats are for. Um, and that I think would handicap them. And obviously, like as a socialist, I would have the criticism that, well, AOC and Squad, they're just Democrats anyway, so they are part of the party of the ruling class, even if they're like to the left, on the left wing of it anyway. So our project and their project aren't the same anyway. if you see what I mean. They want the working class as a constituency of the Democratic Party, a kind of, you know, where, the progressive capitalist state would, paternally give you stuff in return for your loyalty. Whereas I've of the position that no, the working class should be independent of that, has its own political project to, you know, commit its own self-abolition, as Marx would put it.
Before we start closing out, where do you think the Democratic Party is most likely headed? Because I think it probably will triangulate more to the right, just as it
Yeah.
did with the third way sort of neoliberalism of Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so as well. Because the thing is, the Democratic Party brand is considered toxic because it is associated with things like defund the police, or that's kind of how they, like, people, the strategists will see it, that we lost because people think we're too progressive, that we're associated with these like mad schemes that activists are for, but the party actually isn't for. So how do we disassociate ourselves from that, especially after we've lost to Donald Trump because of these things? Well, let's move more to the right on immigration to compete with Trump on his own ground and break apart his voting coalition so that they'll vote for us, not for them. And with crime, as was the case with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton ran to the right of Bush on crime for this same reason. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to ask you about, we sort of covered it earlier, but the sort of tailism, I think, is sort of a dead end for people that want, radical change, or say like economic change. And it was really weird to me. I had someone say to me recently, the Democratic Party has become the party of billionaires. It's been captured by billionaires. And I just said to them, well, both, like I said, both parties are creatures of the ruling class. It's been this way for, forever. I mean, go back to in history and you can find the Democratic Party was basically a creature of Tammany Hall.
Yeah.
And I think there's this inability that people have to imagine anything outside of those two parties and organizing outside of the two parties. Do you think
Yeah.
that's probably the problem for socialists in this era?
Yeah. I think because I think they understand, like, unconsciously, that what I was talking about that independent working class political project that would produce a socialist party, it's just so difficult to do. That it's almost like, well, won't it be easier to take over one of the capitalist parties and then try and do socialism, from there, like, entryism, and and um and as well, I think there's this pessimism. I think that well, what was once the objective of the past just isn't possible anymore. So, let's do the whole popular front thing with the Democrats. So, and this is why, every elections there's always this thing about the lesser evil. You know, who do we vote for? And obviously, the lesser evil is always the Democrats every time. This is I think Alexander Coburn had a great phrase for it where he called it democratic centralism. Using an old Leninist phrase, like to signifying this kind of dependency on the Democrats, because there's always this idea that, well, we must have leverage over the Democrats, and that's why you had a lot of people on the left saying, well, let's not vote for them, or because of Gaza, and then after that they'll get the message and listen to us next time. that maybe you shouldn't be as supportive of Israel as you were. But the reality is that they're not dependent on you. You're more dependent on them than they are on you. So they can just ignore you. Like they've got no reason to even listen to you. It's like, and they'll just see you as like, children doing a tantrum, um, which is which is funny because the effect of the Democrats as part of this triangulation is not that they move towards Bernie's position or AOC's position on Israel and Palestine, but that they'll have John Fetterman, who is populist, but also very, very pro-Israel. Like, probably more ideologically pro-Israel than even Biden is. So, yeah, that's the funny thing.
I wanted to ask you, too, when it comes to leftist discourse, I think a lot of leftists yell at each other about, I mean, I see a lot of people yell, oh, well, you're a class reductionist if you focus on class. And then on the other hand, you're a race reductionist if you talk about race. Do you think that's also a problem with why the left is sort of stagnant? I mean, it seems like we're caught in this, like, well, you're a reductionist. No, you're like, there's no, it just seems like we go around in circles.
Yeah, I think that, because obviously that whole discourse, are you a class reductionist or a race reductionist, is very 2016, isn't it? But it does kind of reveal a kind of struggle to understand how racial conflicts or racial ideology and capitalism relate to each other. How do they, uh, how do race, class, and capital, relate to each other? Because, you know, as every Marxist, serious Marxist understands, is that with the working class is divided along racial lines or national lines or ethnic lines, and those ethnic divisions are used to provoke antagonisms with each other. So, on the one hand, we have to find a way to not bolster that, so and not and not sort of endorse any racial kind of ideology or any racial explanation for the dynamics of capitalism. But at the same time, we also have to be aware that racial ideology is a thing, even in a post-racial era. Racial ideology still is there, and how and it's just that we kind of struggle with these things because of the way we understand capitalism. I think is very weird because we kind of sort of understand capitalism as like an economic system perpetrated by one group by another group. So like by small, you have the bourgeoisie, and then the working class, and the bourgeoisie oppresses the working class with this thing called capitalism. Now, obviously, Marxists don't see it like that. And then you have shall we call it the race reductionists, or if you will, the black Marxists, if you've read Cedric Robinson, who have the same view, but they just say it's white people with their white supremacy, and capitalism is their handmaiden of white supremacy. If you know what I mean, that they have this very racialized understanding of history, that white supremacy is the moving direction of history. And I think these debates have really kind of distorted the problem of capitalism, because the problem of capitalism is, how is it that a society that experienced emancipation, French Revolution, American Revolution, how is it that this society has come to a degree where it self-dominates itself through capital? It's not, oh, the bad people are oppressing us, and therefore if we get rid of the bad people, everything will be okay. It's about how is it our society is dominating itself with its own hand, and how is it that we can sort of, so to speak, self-emancipate ourselves from our self-domination. And that's where the working class comes in, because the working class is central to capitalism. Capitalism moves in part or in great deal because of the activity of the working class, but except the working class does this unconsciously. So the Marxist thesis is, if the working class was to do this consciously, and hence, the whole thing about dictatorship of the proletariat, the transition towards, and that's the whole reasoning behind it, so that man would no longer be a victim of his own making, but become,
Could you
a,
repeat that? He would no longer be a what?
a victim of his own making. That he would, so to speak, be a fully fledged autonomous subject, you know, for the first time in history. It's a very I hope I made a lot of sense, because that is putting a very complicated argument in a very bite-sized form.
Well, what I think we'll have to have another argument just going into like understanding Marxism for my
Yeah,
listeners. So I do have a
yeah,
lot of Marxist listeners, but I also, I think sometimes people just have lost sight of what the word means, you know?
yeah. Well, yeah, Marxism has its own internal controversies as much as any ideology does.
Real quick, you mentioned the sort of professionals. Can you speak more to that? Because I do think that's an issue where I think there's a lot of people, and maybe I would even include myself in this. I'm probably guilty of it at times. I mean, I think anyone in media is, but I think you have a lot of people that are sort of media or pundits, or they call themselves alternative media, that will say they're anti-democrat, but it's not that they're anti-democrat. It's that they want to be
In the Democratic Party.
right. They want to be the person at the top of the Democratic Party, and they're usually Monday morning quarterbacking, saying, "Well, if you would have
Yeah,
listened to us," but they
yeah,
still want to
yeah,
be part of that structure, you know.
yeah. I think because unfortunately, one of the tragic things about socialism today is that if you are a socialist, it's more like it's expressing a petty bourgeois discontent with capitalism, as opposed to, being the real movement of history within the working class.
You
That,
said a petty bourgeois. What? It cut out for a second.
oh, petty bourgeois discontent. So it's like, that's what I mean by the D class A professionals and um, the wannabe intellectuals. Like, that's how they express their discontent with capitalism, because obviously capitalism isn't working so well for even, middle class people, like middle class people, or educated people who went to college or
Well, they
university
feel
and
the
got,
squeeze now on them
yeah,
too. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, because they're struggling to get a house, you know
Well,
do
even
all
pay
the
rent. Yeah, yeah.
pay rent, do all those things that, what their parents and their grandparents were supposed did, and it's not working out for them. So then, especially you saw this after the 2008 crisis, that this reaching for Marxism, for socialism, and as a way of sort of expressing, like, your discontent with capitalism, but but at the same time that these words, became so abstracted from their sort of social base. Like, the most amount of Marxists you'll find is in the university, or socialists. It's very much, the working class. It's like, so there's just this distance between people who call themselves socialists and working class people.
Well, even in the
Yeah,
university, right? I mean, like
yeah,
a lot of Marxists are kind of cornered into like very specific sectors of
yeah,
academia. Like a lot of them are huddled into like political economy departments and whatnot. Yeah,
yeah. So, or political science, or
yeah.
even literary theory, or stuff like that. So yeah, it's I think there's this sort of disconnect between theory and praxis. That's the old unity that that's what Marxism was famous for, that it united theory and praxis together. And now there's just this big disconnect that that's why socialism isn't as it once was. And how you, so to speak, make socialism rooted in the working class again, that's a very hard subject, and I don't have an easy answer for it, I'm afraid.
There's just two more things I wanted to hit on.
Yeah.
So what draws you towards socialism and Marxism? Because I think your answer to that will be very enlightening for my listeners, and I think it has to do, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it has to do with this sort of emancipatory project
Yeah.
of socialism. And I often think people forget that it is
Yeah.
at root an emancipatory liberationist sort of project.
Yeah, it's because socialism, as I understand it, is for freedom. It is to complete the project of freedom that originates in the bourgeois revolutions, but that project of modern project of freedom has come into crisis under capitalism. And Marxism understands itself as finding a way to solve that problem so that humanity can be free, and so that this expression that Marx uses in the Communist Manifesto, so that we reach a society where the freedom of each is the precondition for the freedom of all. So that you have this synergy between individual freedom and collective freedom. The freedom of society. I mean, the first 6 letters of the word socialism should be a big hint. Socialism. We are for the freedom of society. That's what we are for, and that's what brought me to socialism, to Marxism, because I found it this very compelling, powerful, sophisticated philosophy of history that about what Hegel called the progress in the consciousness of freedom, and Marx revised that through class struggle, and yeah, that's how I see socialism, to complete the modern project of freedom, so that humanity can escape its prehistory and enter true history, so that we can actually begin history. This is not the end of history. This is only beginning.
What do you mean by freedom then, if people are confused?
Freedom. Well, I think it's the freedom that humanity or society can have full mastery of the natural and social worlds. That's basically what I would mean. That society can revise and recreate its own social relations. That we can transform the earth even and society to our own ends, for our own. I don't want to say wants, is if that's the right word to use, but capitalism disjoints that, because on the one hand we have climate crisis and the problems within society, but that problem that capitalism shows us at the same time reveals its potential. It's like a very distorted potential with it, because under capitalism, humanity has remade the earth. Like, it really has. The earth has been really transformed, but it's done so in very distorted ways, which produces the climate crisis we have.
Well, not
But
just climate, but even like issues like,
yeah,
I'm assuming like issues like hunger would be included in the lack of freedom,
yeah, ecological crisis, lack of freedom, the fact that we still have the big state under capitalism. So all those libertarians that talk about, socialism's big government, it's like, we already have that big government, by the way. So that's what, that's the utopian dimension of Marxism, that to overcome the state so that society can govern itself and self-regulate itself without an overbearing state necessary. So, the government of men being replaced by the administration of things, it's a callback to, Thomas Paine, where he talks about, all the good things are in society while all the bad things are in government, that sort of thing.
In closing here, I know we haven't given like all the answers. We're not like looking into a crystal ball and saying this is what we must do,
Yeah.
and I think that's a good thing about the conversations I've had with you is that, I think the sort of all clues, no solutions right now conversations are important because, I think sometimes we have too many people saying they have the one answer.
Yeah. I
Um,
think I
mhm.
just want to say there that, the point of Marxism, as I see it, is not that it has like some ready made answer tied into a bow, but that it tries to clarify the problem that we face. How, why is it that under the society we live in, we have a value system that is liberal and democratic, yet our society functions in such a way that it undermines and really distorts that liberal and democratic character. Why does that happen? Why is it that, again, our value system says that, wars are bad? That's liberalism. Liberalism is anti-war. But how can we live in a world and a world order that creates so many wars and conflicts, and seemingly we can't do anything to stop it? It's that those sort of, very deep questions that Marxism seeks to clarify and reformulate the problem that we've had for the past 200 years. That's what we live in, 200 years of capitalism. That's what Marxism is about, not trying to, it doesn't like give a ready-made answer, because I think we should be very careful of that, because it should be about provoking people to think more deeply, more seriously about these questions. And then maybe at some point we can, okay, now we have a strategy to deal with the problem. But first you have to understand the problem first and clarify it.
I guess that was the that maybe you already answered the last question I had, but the last question was going to be, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation? Being that, it's not a conversation that necessarily provides clear solutions, but it's a conversation that I do think provides something. I think it provides some clarification. What do you want my listeners to get out of the conversation we've just had?
Well, that to understand that, well, don't it's not the end of the world. That's and that, you know at the same time, that this should be a moment of reflection, that where we think more deeply and try to clarify what the problem is that we want to solve before we go ahead to actually try to solve the problem. Because if we don't clarify the problem properly, we might we'll misrecognize it, and what we try to do to solve it might end up making a worse solution. Might lead to a worse outcome than what we intended it to, or might not even go anywhere at all. So that's what the listeners should take out of this.
Well, hey, Ralph Leonard, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work?
You can follow me on Twitter which is at buff soldier underscore 96. So you can follow me there. You can read my stuff at Unheard, Sublation Magazine, and now the New Statesman. So you can type my name, and you'll find on Google, and you'll find me quite easily to read. So yeah.
I didn't realize you were at the New Statesman now. Congrats on that.
Thanks.
Until next time. You've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.